It may be quite difficult to articulate what is changing in the global order. The nations remain the same. The visible political structures remain unaltered, and at least at present, there has been no world war. Yet for increasingly more and more of the population, there's a sense that the fundamental ordering of the world is being changed. This can be difficult to articulate. After all, what exactly is the post-war order? What is liberal democracy? What is the liberal world order? Well, one word that people keep coming back to is globalism. Globalism is a curious entity, for while it's a nebulous term, we all know what it means, and while it is conceptually vague, we know the names of its players and its institutions. Much of the globalist apparatus that was built following the Second World War was a tension between the American, Soviet, and British viewpoints. Franklin Roosevelt, and some of those around him, viewed the idea of institutions like the United Nations as an opportunity where sovereign nations of the world could impose authority over the mandates of the old empires. The Soviets were major contributors to building some of these institutions, though quite quickly became disillusioned. For the establishments of Britain and the continent, it was quite obvious that this vision would work against their interests, and so all the while they had a quite different view, a view which existed within the policy establishments across Europe, the British Commonwealth, remnants of the European empires, and increasingly, more within the United States ruling class. They sought to translate the old imperial policies of the 19th century into these new global institutions, to put new branding on old empires. The idea of a multi-nation body was quite old. During the Second World War, the League of Nations had already been established and attempted, yet the League of Nations was not the first of these such endeavors, with earlier forms of this sort of notion going back to the Peace of Westphalia. In 1942, 26 nations would sign on to the Declaration by United Nations, an anti-Axis power organization. Over the following years, prominent figures across the Allied powers, and particularly in the United Kingdom, would meet and begin discussing the idea of a global institution of nations. There were many ideas going around the ruling class of Britain at this point. A sort of spiritual universalism had become quite prominent amongst its upper class, particularly influenced by theosophy and offshoot philosophies, a New Age spiritual system which attempted to syncretize religions from across the world. An idea was beginning to emerge, that perhaps the peaceful future would be one of no distinction across the world. For after all, nuggets of God's wisdom are buried within all religions, and going back to even earlier British liberalism, it was thought that men are blank slates, and that everyone of all the world is just a liberal in waiting, differentiated and kept apart by unscrupulous rulers and the improper imposition of societal burdens. If it weren't for superstitions, for self-interested rulers, and for backward religions, then everyone would be just like the British liberal. As the ruling class began to integrate this more and more with theosophical New Age beliefs, all while holding to the Victorian notions of the role of empire, it flowed naturally the idea that the proper liberal ruling class should build international bodies where the petty differences of nationality would be put aside, and all humanity could be brought into a new age, no longer differentiated, just one great brotherhood of man. A charter for the United Nations would be signed in June of 1945, signed onto by 50 member nations initially, and this new international establishment would begin setting out the means by which to implement its vision. In November of that year, UNESCO would be established. They would hold meetings in London, attempting to address one fatal flaw in their vision. This new class of global imperialist knew that its ideas were just and right, yet it knew that the pettiness of the simple little people of the world would keep them from understanding the greater vision. They thought that the simple underclasses of the world would be too bound by ideas like nation and history and people and religion. They needed some way to undo these archaic notions. A new political apparatus was not enough. They needed some way to change the hearts and minds of men. UNESCO would be the agency designed for this purpose. They needed a way to spread this universalist message across the world. They would set their sights on education, setting up schools across the world. They would create books and film. And perhaps, while they could not change the minds of those now living, they thought perhaps future generations may be influenced. Independent organizations would join on board, including the theosophical offshoot, the Lucius Trust, previously known as the Lucifer Publishing Company. These upper and upper middle class organizations, which held these universalist spiritual ideas, would be very influential in the establishment of UNESCO. For this wasn't simply a set of political notions held by the ruling class, but was to great extent a religious belief. It was a utopian belief, and they believed that they had been charged with ushering man into the new age, the age of peace, prosperity, harmony, and no differentiation. A world of no peoples, no religion, and no nations. Pre-existing imperial organizations would act as the backbone for the new global apparatus being built. Organizations spun out of Milner's Roundtable Group would serve as nodes for the ties between Britain and the United States, as well as serve as a think tank for the now united Anglo-American foreign policy. Chatham House would as well serve this purpose, acting as a major central hub for Anglo-American foreign policy. Zionist groups would further solidify in Britain and the United States, forging a great deal of Middle Eastern policy. In 1954, the first meeting of the Bilderberg Group would be held. Former Polish politician Josef Rettinger and the Dutch Prince Bernhard would begin pulling together financial, political, economic, and academic leaders from across the order. This was to be a new era, one where the ruling classes across the West were no longer distinct ruling classes of distinct nations, but were one united ruling class of the post-war order. Many new institutions like this would follow, although most not as exclusive. In 1971, the World Economic Forum would be founded, originally named the European Management Forum, after US dollar gold convertibility had ended, and the Bretton Woods system had functionally ceased to exist. The idea of this group was to create a new coordinated system for the financial and corporate leaders of the liberal world order. They would go through different iterations. However, they would ultimately settle on a viewpoint which viewed themselves as stewards of the world. One quite prominent belief in this regard is the idea of stakeholder capitalism. The idea being that corporate activity has such wide-reaching effects that the actions of corporations couldn't be left simply to the will of shareholders, that they needed to serve a greater purpose, a purpose for the interest of the people, and for the liberal world order itself. Yet, of course, corporations couldn't be counted on to themselves institute this, so they would need somebody else to guide them, somebody to ensure that the interests of all the stakeholders, by which they mean everyone, would be satisfied. So they began to set out guidelines, and particularly by the time of the 2010s, utilize methods like the ESG rating system so that they could guide corporations toward their vision. They were to be the stewards of the world's economy, an economy which would serve the people whose interests they understood. Throughout the 20th century, the sheer number of global institutions became enormous. Global non-government organizations became a very comfy job that a politician or a financier might have after their tenure. And as these institutions were so integrated with governments and businesses across the liberal world order, and more these corporations became run by bureaucrats, the model of the liberal world order was quite straightforward. Global institutions loyal to a nationless ruling class who believed in a utopian vision of no borders, no religions, no creeds, and who through globalist bodies, free from the purview of government or democracy, would issue instructions to the bureaucrats of the businesses across the world. This was a quite comfy arrangement, and one that made the ruling class of the liberal world order very secure. The global superbanks of the IMF, World Bank, and Bank for International Settlements would ensure that the nations of the world were kept within the Western debt scheme. Intelligence agencies and non-government organizations would manipulate the hearts and minds of people around the world. And all the while, mountains and mountains of bureaucrats would take orders from faceless organizations with the interests and desires of peoples and nations functionally irrelevant. This seemed to be an indestructible system, a vast global faceless bureaucracy A ruling class loyal to global institutions and not to any nation? An international financial system, which created dollars for itself. How could such a system ever fall down? Well, quite simply, it failed. These institutions may have worked when the war generations were running them, but there's a reliable pattern in human history. When a system is set up to run slow and steady, it becomes more and more bureaucratic. This bureaucracy maintains stability, but is incapable of responding to crises, and as the generations who found institutions die, later generations who never had to experience crisis or look at the real world are unable to maintain those institutions as they become too detached and too coddled. Simply, the ruling class became less capable, and the bureaucracies became too large. But more than that, the world that these institutions were set up to exist in no longer existed. The efforts of Anglo-America to buy out Russia failed. The efforts to buy out China failed. More and more of the world came to truly resent the financial power maintained over them by Western bankers. Commodity producers could no longer tolerate the constant manipulation of their goods in futures markets. And as the military capability of the West degraded, it became clear that there was no way for these sorts of organizations to maintain control. But on a deeper level, their beliefs were rejected. This global internationalist liberal story of no nations, no religions, no peoples, simply ran up against reality. For the beliefs embedded in this ideology hold that the goal of the liberal state is to break the chains of obligation imposed on people. They believe that things like nation, church, and the interpersonal obligations people are born into are unfair impositions, ones that should be destroyed by the state. Yet these mutual obligations were the very things that had enabled the prosperity of the West to occur in the first place. They were the very things that gave people a sense of meaning in life. And so as the economies of the West became more and more debt-based, all while the conditions for prosperity eroded away, people came to realize that the visions and promises of the global institutions and their followers were just untrue. There was no way to maintain the right to rule story that these institutions had enjoyed. Populations across the world began to look at these institutions, and they went from being perhaps stuffy and bureaucratic, yet prestigious, to vilified and hated groups. Not long ago, the idea of being a Davos man was something of great pride and prestige. It meant that one had made it, he was a big success, and now he could go hang out with the important, successful people of the world. Yet now it's synonymous with self-important, delusional, inbred parasite. There was just no way for such an institution to maintain its image, let alone its influence. The bureaucratic global management class and the global ruling elite class became globally despised. And so as the 2020s went on, and the new American administration began, the greatest target of the ire of American force would be these very institutions. The 2025 World Economic Forum meeting would feature constant denigration, with 2026 even more brutal. Global institutional funding would be cut off, NGO money would be taken away, with federal investigations into some. All the while, major businesses began to sever ties, and the national defense apparatus of the United States would issue an entirely new framework, one where great powers act as great powers, asserting dominance over their regions, one where the United States dominates its hemisphere, but no longer seeks to be the world's policeman on the part of the Anglo-American establishment, and one where these global institutions may be ignored. At every level, a rift was being wedged open between global institutions and the United States, and as the United States had both served as the funding source and the muscle for these institutions and the global ruling class, this was one nation that simply could not be allowed to break away, and so a fight ensued. This leaves us at today. America appears to be trying to break itself off from the global institutions that have dominated the post-war order, all while constantly attacking these institutions and creating new parallel systems and institutions based on the sovereigntist viewpoint of the United States, Russia, China, and the commodity-producing nations. Yet the global institutions are fighting for their lives. This ruling class is fighting to maintain what it has had. And so that's the fight at the very heart of today. Globalism isn't simply a viewpoint, it's an apparatus. It's the NGOs, the intelligence agencies, the international banks. It's the entities like UNESCO, and it's a ruling class. Some members of this class appear to have jumped ship, yet by and large, most of them appear unwilling to go down without a fight. Two visions stretch out ahead. One, a world of sovereign nations with great powers and spheres of influence. One where ideas like borders, nations, peoples, religions, and cultures have great weight and are highly valued. One where global Eurodollar finance does not dictate the economies of every country in the world. And yet another that seeks to continue as things have. A world where the ruling class has no home, where vast bureaucracies manage the lives of all nations. One where perhaps nations themselves fade away, with the European Union as a prototype. One where liberal internationalism is enforced upon the world, and where bit by bit peoples lose their identities, and all is brought under the liberal world order. A military system, a legal system, and a financial system dominated by Eurodollar finance. And while the fight between these two visions is quite real, there really isn't any possibility for the second. That isn't to say that by necessity the sovereigntist vision will prevail. Yet regardless of outcome, things simply cannot go back to how they were. The old institutions have failed, and they can't be put back together. There are going to be powerful sovereign nations. It's just a question of who is amongst their ranks. The populations of the West will no longer accept the right to rule stories of old. There's a crisis of illegitimacy. There are cultural, religious, and ethnic clashes in Europe, and people no longer believe in the economic story. The American military cannot continue to act as the world's policeman as it once had. There are spheres of influence which simply will be taken by nations like Russia and China. This debt system is reaching its limit, and at its deepest level, the right to rule story of liberal globalism was entirely dependent on momentum. It required a constant narrative to be maintained across its nations. It required constant enforcement, and it required a belief that the world was constantly working toward the liberal utopian vision. Yet once that shattered, once people stopped believing, there's no way to undo that. People can't be brought back to it. It's a system dependent entirely on momentum and the maintenance of narrative. So regardless of what the future is going to look like, one thing that is certain, it will not look like the past. And much of this ruling class and these institutions know this. They know that the embedded obligations in the Western welfare states are impossible. They know that under their model, the prosperity of old will not continue. And so they have attempted to set up new narratives, one being the new scarcity narrative. The idea is this: the world has become too materialistic, too focused on wealth and goods. It should become something more soft and sentimental, and while communities have been eroded, perhaps the world would do better with more close-knit communities. Cities where people live closer together, where people don't expect such constant growth, and one where we care for the environment more. And being that such constant industrial output is no longer required, the world can move to cleaner energy sources, smaller close-knit towns, less material, clean energy. It's quite nice branding, but it's not what its professors actually believe. This is branding for austerity, a justification for why the system no longer produces. All the while, in nations like Britain and those of the European Union, capital control systems are being built. There are heavier and heavier crackdowns on speech and on online communication, all while the nations speak of conscription and a future war. Central bank digital currencies are perhaps one of the most striking examples of this general trend. And what is this? This is keeping the nations locked down when it becomes clear that the system will no longer continue. For in such a scenario, it's quite probable that there will be sovereign debt crises. And if the old ruling classes wish to maintain what they have had, they must make sure that the money doesn't run away. They must make sure that they are not overthrown. This internationalist class does not need to live in these countries directly, but it needs to maintain some apparatuses so that its wealth and power may be maintained, even if they choose to abscond and live in somewhere else. At all levels, it's understood that this system is ending. Many look to the political and social actors who have spoke of its demise, blaming them for the current situation, as though if they simply hadn't said anything, we would still be in 1990's end of history. If only these populists had just kept their mouths shut, then it would be just like Seinfeld was still on TV. But this is just trying to find an outlet for fear and frustration. All sides of this current conflict know that it is ending, and now the fight is for what the next system will look like. Great powers, sovereignty, and peoples, or international finance, bureaucracy, and global institutional control. The post-war order is broken. As the world emerged into the 2020s, this became increasingly evident. Yet to those who sit atop it, those for whom the rules-based order has provided great benefit and wealth, and their comfortable functionaries, this reality was pushed aside, preferring to continue to live in the end of history. Yet for as much as the ruling factions of the liberal world order wanted to pretend this away, all that they could do was ignore, yet they could never shield themselves from the true reality of the world. The post-war order depended on a system of perpetual debt, a debt system based on the rehypothecation of US dollars. Under this system, banks around the world, particularly those based in London, Paris, and the offshore havens, would issue enormous amounts of US dollar credit, all with quite little reserves. Leverage upon leverage would create the boom of globalization. It would create fabulous fortunes around the world, and with this leverage came the ability to push down commodity prices, allowing for international financiers to build an enormous paper market for commodities, yet never have to make delivery, generating more and more wealth as the size of the world's dollars ballooned, while its real assets remained stagnant. This system required the US government to go deeper and deeper into debt, issuing more and more treasury securities to liquefy this international dollar market. Loans would be written on top of loans, and derivatives would be bet on top of derivatives, foreign banks creating dollars, using dollars to build up an enormous paper market for commodities, to push down real assets and lever the system up and up, all while the purchasing power of Americans was drained as their dollars became worth less and less, and the government went deeper into debt. That system simply could not continue. Under Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, the institutions of the US dollar began to tear apart the old credit system. Interest rates were higher. The new credit pricing system of SOFR allowed for the true conditions of the collateralized repo market in the United States to be the basis for credit pricing. Gold buying in the US and China would push up that artificially cheap collateral, draining the Eurodollar banks more and more, forcing them to make delivery on contracts that they expected to keep devalued in perpetuity. Tariffs would stem the constant outflow of dollars into the offshore money center banks. Deregulation would allow the US balance sheet to become properly priced, and for the nation to delever. The US dollar would be devalued against the euro, putting strain on the Europeans and forcing them to come to the table for new trade negotiations. Japanese interest rates would be allowed to rise, crippling the liquidity machine of the yen carry trade. And all the while, the offshore credit system that was the lifeblood of globalism itself was drained away bit by bit. Yet even if one wanted to continue the system of globalization, this too was coming to an end. What more could be offshored? So much of the economies of the West had been hollowed out, once great factories left to rust, hard industry and hard assets withered away, sent overseas to cheap workers. Foreign capital gained immense wealth, as input and labor prices were driven down, all while the working classes of the West simply lost everything. For a time, the ruling classes were able to turn around to the lower classes and tell them that their lives had improved, that there were now cheaper appliances in the store. Yet, as hope withered away, as their local communities were left to rust, and as everything that had made them vibrant, made them believe, was ground down into dust. There was simply no way to continue the globalization story. The nations of the West had lost vital elements of their supply chains. In any true crisis, the nations of the West could no longer sustain themselves, all while energy policies across the West drove Europe further and further into economic strain and ground down American growth. Simply, the financial and the economic system of the liberal world order could no longer continue. Not only was there no longer belief in it, not only was there serious resentment on the part of the lower classes, but there was just not much more that could be done. Not much more that could be offshored. The economies of the West, the real economies, had been ground down just too much. A nation cannot survive very long as a services, finance, and consumer-based economy. The financialized system was hitting its limit. Leverage was too great, and more of the populations of the West were dissatisfied and pessimistic. People are capable of going through great hardship, and while the true economic abundance of the West is still something quite magnificent in the scope of human history, one thing that people just can't handle is a sense that there's no hope, that they will have a worse life than their parents, and their children will have worse lives than them. People need growth, people need optimism, people need something to believe in, and the liberal globalization story from the ruling classes of the West had simply lost all credibility. The story of the end of history, the story of the rules-based order, and how conflict would now be resolved by international bodies beholden to a rule set, and not through material and military reality, was as well losing all belief. Many, particularly the globalist ruling classes of Europe, continued to hold to the story of the rules-based order, telling a story that the world had achieved peace under a system of rules where the realities of might and weakness had been done away with. Yet, as the post-war order had created a state of perpetual war, where the American military was required to intervene constantly around the world, the story of the end of history and the rules-based order began to be seen for what it was, the velvet glove around the iron fist. There were no rules. The rules were nice dressing for the might-makes-right reality of Anglo-America that had always dominated since the end of the Second World War. What were these rules? The liberal world order fights for democracy. That story became untenable, as it became quite evident that more often, the United States would fight on the part of dictatorships, in many cases destroying democratic systems in order to install regime-friendly dictatorships. The story of preserving peace could no longer be maintained, and yet more than the collapse of the story, more than the realization that the rules were simply the rationalization of Anglo-American interests and a justification of a constant war footing, the military capacity of Anglo-America was degrading for this purpose. Over the course of the global war on terror, the military of the West had changed greatly. Its special operations capacity became quite strong, and its signals intelligence capability became one of, if not the greatest in the world. Yet its ability to fight conventional wars deteriorated, its ability for state-on-state combat had crumbled, and its human intelligence capabilities began to fall behind. This may have all been manageable in the end-of-history world, where the only thing the West need concern itself with is insurgents and non-state actors. Yet the West began to see that powers like Russia, Iran, and particularly China may not be manageable with this military model. And more than that, it became only the United States that had such a capacity to even consider such a conflict. Europe had destroyed its militaries. NATO, by and large, became America and the little buddy holding the flashlight. As Western leaders became more concerned with the potentiality of a Chinese conflict, this state of affairs became more evident. And globally too, more concern began to emerge as to the capacity of the United States Navy to maintain sea routes, and particularly the ability to assert in the Pacific near China. The ability to demonstrate the overwhelming might of United States martial force, the ability to assert hegemony and the liberal world order against other powers that had been assumed since the monopolar moment following the fall of the Soviet Union was losing credibility. Europe had become entirely dependent on the United States, America's military, America's power projection, and America's dollar. Europe was becoming a retirement home, and more than the material conditions, something had fundamentally changed over the decades of the 20th century. The leadership of Europe had become terrified of risk. So jarred by the conflicts of the 20th century, the ethos of the European elite had become one of stagnance and managed decline. The belief held that rapid economic development was unpredictable, and with unpredictability came social strife. Therefore, it was better to keep the economy in stasis, and to keep the population comfortable with a welfare state. Yet as the economic model of liberal globalism began to fall apart, and the United States asserted its financial system against that of Europe and offshore US dollar credit, it became quite obvious that these welfare states could not be maintained. And following the repo crisis of 2019 and the mass liquidity injections of 2020 to 2022, Europe was facing a real fiscal problem. More and more, people began to realize that the sovereign debts of Europe were truly precarious, that there was no way for Europe to carry on, and that this debt system was coming to an end. Yet all the same, Europe's leadership simply could not handle the risks that would come from a chaotic economy. The psychology of the bureaucratic leadership of Europe was one that managed decline was better than unpredictable growth, and so more and more, it ate away into its ability to sustain itself. It required the United States if it wished to carry on, and as the new American administration began, it became quite clear that the United States was no longer willing to support Europe's lifestyle. Financially and militarily, Daddy America was going away. The West was facing real societal strain. The Western ethos had become one of hyperliberalism, a belief that social bonds that make demands on people should be eliminated to truly liberate all people. The liberal state of the 20th and 21st century viewed itself as the breaker of chains, that the demands of society, family, religion, and people were illiberal propositions, and that the state could make all free, and make it so everyone was free to live their lives focused entirely on their whims and identity, requiring no social attachments nor obligations, and able to live dependent on only one entity, the liberal state. Yet as population growth began to fall, a serious problem had emerged. The welfare states on the West depended on a model of perpetual growth. There was simply no way to support the baby boom retirees, everyone claiming benefits, the massive share claiming disability payments, and the ever-increasing sums of societal subsidies. An idea emerged that perhaps by importing a larger population this could be remedied, yet this only created more of a problem. Some nations, particularly the United Kingdom, would increase benefit payments to immigrants, believing that through the velocity of money, their GDP and economic figures could be improved, bolstering the market for their sovereign debt. Many countries believed that this could keep down labor costs, and for many, there was a hope that the enormous population imbalance could be solved, and that the obligations made to the older retired populations could be satisfied. Yet on the economic front, this was simply running against the clock. An economic drain began to emerge, yet perhaps greater, social strife rose. Some viewed this as an opportunity to fracture their societies. Some saw an opportunity to gain voting support. Some would see avenues for self-enrichment. And for the capital-obsessed utopians, many began to dream of a world of a docile, heterogeneous, and cheap population of the West. The West had become increasingly focused on the ideas of identity, sexual identity, social identity, and ethnic identity, all subjugated to the liberal premises of liberation, the breaking of chains. Yet as economic conditions worsened, as hope began to fall away, as towns and cities that had maintained cultures for centuries became unrecognizable, and different populations began to clash, this promise all fell apart. Conflict was rising, pessimism was great, the economic and financial models were falling apart, Anglo-America's military capabilities were coming into question, and foreign powers were rising. The culture and the obligations that had built the society capable of making such promises had been repressed. For the wealth and dynamism of the West had not come from financialization. It had not come from taxes, nor had it come from cheap laborers. It had come from societies that had those very mutual obligations that had been destroyed by the liberal state. It came from people being parts of families, parts of communities, parts of peoples, parts of towns, parts of churches, and parts of civilization. And as that had eroded away, as the chains had been broken, and as the societies of ancient peoples had come under more and more strain, the growth and prosperity conditions simply no longer were there. The people no longer believed in the future of the liberal world order. People no longer believed in their governments nor their societies. And so, as everything that had defined the post-war order had now clearly fallen apart, it had become clear that the order was ending. Many would look to the messengers, blaming them. If only these figures hadn't pointed out the problems within liberal globalism, then we would still be in the end of history. If only they hadn't pointed out what was going wrong, then it would still be the 1990s. Much of the focus became one of blaming the messengers. If they just said nothing, then it would all be as it was. But this was untrue. The order was ending one way or another. The only question became how the ending would be managed. The American regime began to assert the idea of relationships between sovereign nations, an economy based on industry, on the working class, and on real assets. One where economies strive to become self-sufficient and powerful, bound by obligation to their own people and not to international bodies nor rules. One where nations come to each other's aid because of the relationships that exist between two sovereign forces, and not two cogs in a set of rules built for the benefit of global capital. Other great nations would come to similar ideas. Chinese sovereigntism and nationalism would assert itself more and more powerfully. The Russians would come to realize that the Europeans really were their enemies. Nations of Africa would push out remnants of European financial power. And more, the world had rejected liberal globalism. Though it became clear that the end of history had itself ended, and that the liberal world order was transforming into something new, the old powers of international finance, global bodies, and intelligent states were unwilling to relinquish their wealth and power. And so the global game board became a great conflict. A conflict between the international financial families, the international bureaucrats, the intelligence apparatuses, and the civil servant bureaucracies. The international foxes who ruled by language and schemes against the forces of the sovereigntist lions, those who ruled by declaration and strength. The conflict would be international, yet it would not be state versus state. The world had entered into a conflict between systems of government, between models of economic power. What we would see wouldn't look like the United States versus Europe. Even in the language used, it would be something more like Donald Trump versus Europe, man versus machine, the will of man versus systems and bureaucratic mechanisms. More and more sovereigntist leaders would rise around the world, and dissatisfaction would increase in lands dominated by liberal globalism. There was a trend asserting itself, and as 2025 went on, it became more and more clear that the old system was reaching its end, and now was just a fight for who could hang on to what. Either way, the old model was gone. So now, as we stand here in a battle between men and peoples versus systems and machines, between competing models for the future and fending off theft at the hands of the faceless, there are many moving parts on the global game board. For this is a global reordering, and as the old international institutions decay, individual nations are increasingly looking toward their own unique needs and goals. So we will look through different regions of the globe and try to see if we can ascertain what they might look like. As this global transformation reaches its new form.